a little bit about Travis to give the respect where respect is due. Uh, Travis is with Climate Interactive and helps decision makers tackle complex issues, including sustainable food systems, community resiliency, climate mitigation, and energy system transformation. He is currently leading Climate Interactive's efforts to apply interactive decision support tools to understand how climate change impacts agriculture and people's livelihoods. Um, I'll spare some of the background and some of the um, communities that Travis gets to impact, but you can imagine being with Climate Interactive and how influential it has been. Some of the people that he's had to interact with through the UN, probably the largest one, but so many organizations around the world. Travis started his education at Iowa State University, but got his advanced degrees at MIT, where he is also an affiliate faculty in the Joint Program on Science and Policy for Global Change and the Sloan School of Management. And so that's some more detail if you didn't know about Travis. And so I'll now turn it over to him for his presentation to us, and we're so glad to have him here. So thank you, Travis.
Great. Well, thank you, Ben, and Hector for organizing, and everyone for attending. I've really enjoyed having these regular monthly meetings of the SIG. I know at the last Systematics conference, Hector and I were discussing, and everyone was discussing like, hey, we actually want to keep this conversation around ag and food systems going. So this is great that it's Hector that you've picked up and Ben have picked up the mantle and continued. So thank you. I'm gonna probably design this and talk about this meeting, this flow of the meeting, and a little differently than we've done before. I'm not gonna have slides. And instead what I'm going to do is kind of talk about it in maybe 3 parts. Of course, maybe a short intro about like Climate Interactive and maybe a little bit more about me for those who don't know. And then I want to show you En-ROADS, which is the main topic of the meeting. And I'm going to give a short demonstration. We do webinars on En-ROADS, and people use it for lengths of time. It could be 20 minutes, it could be 2 hours, depending on how they're facilitating and things. So I will probably give a shortish demo, which will be interactive. So my understanding is that people can unmute themselves. Is that right, Hector? Thumbs up?
Yes, that's correct.
Or Ben? Yeah, okay, great. So at some point, even though the rules are you should stay muted, there'll be a couple times when feel free to come off the mute, and that's what I would like that. And also you can raise hands or do whatever else to ask questions along the way. So after a short intro of Climate Interactive, I'm going to be talking a little bit about En-ROADS and trying to give a demonstration, because I think sometimes if you haven't experienced it or just seen what it is to have a real-time simulation decision support tool, it's useful to see it in action. Then the second part of the presentation will just be actually taking off the sort of facilitator role, how you use En-ROADS, and talking more about like some of the tech. Because I slow down. That's not something we normally would include, but this is a Systematics group, and so why don't we spend some time thinking about the actual technologies in Systematics, the underlying technologies and how to use models or deploy models and some things like that. And I'll spend as much time on that as you like, but I just think it's useful to see and hear. And then the third part is that I want to talk about future directions. So and this gets back to the food system work in particular that we expect to and hope to have done later this year. So that's what I'm going to be doing. So Climate Interactive is a nonprofit based in the United States, although we are just hired a couple of people. And so we actually have, we have a modeler joining us from Istanbul, and he'll be starting Monday. So that's very exciting for us. And we have people in Nepal, and we've had people employed in Africa, and we've had a variety of people around the world at times. We're based in the United States. As Ben mentioned, we do focus on building tools that help people see what works. That's sort of the tagline. And in particular, we do focus on sort of 3 different areas of focus. We focus on decision makers, whether that's politicians, UN negotiators, et cetera, sort of the business, the C-suites. We focus on media. We work with media outlets to make sure that they can understand ideas, and that's sort of twofold. we work with them to make sure that when there's a big policy announcement, say the rollback of the Clean Power Plan in the United States, which was Obama's, Trump rolled back Obama's, one of the ways to help us achieve the Paris Agreement, Paris Accord. You know, we can do sort of fast analysis to help people drafting articles and publishing on short deadlines, and understand how that an announcement might impact climate change and temperature down the road. We also work with the media in a second way, which would really be focusing on building interactive stories. And so these might take more than just the sort of fast turnaround cycle, but we recently had our model, En-ROADS itself, embedded in a Bloomberg News page and various other things. And again, that's maybe a little more on the tech side of things, but we can talk about that. And then the third category of people, so decision makers, media, is really empowering climate leaders around the world. And so right now we're actually, and later today, you're welcome to join us at 2 p.m. Eastern if you'd like, is our 7th, I believe, out of 8 sessions of our En-ROADS training. We actually have a training series where you can become an En-ROADS climate ambassador. And that is helping empower leaders to go and use our tools to have the conversations that they need to have around clean energy and climate change and a transition and food systems, et cetera. As you'll see, En-ROADS is pretty broad. So that's the kind of thing where we focus on those 3 groups. It's actually pretty much a lot of people, but we do try to just acknowledge that we have certain target purposes and audiences that we spend our time trying to address. Just a little more background about some of the tools. We've had you know, thousands of people attending our webinars lately. We currently are having, we had somewhere over between 1,000 and 2,000 people sign up for this 8-part series. We've had several hundred go through and become, since January, become En-ROADS climate ambassadors. We've had people have self-reported using our tools by 70,000 people around the world. And as such, I just mainly say the numbers of to talk about 2 different things. One, there's a huge need for really rich and robust climate simulators in general around important issues. But I'd say tools like what we're providing, which I think is really important as people start thinking about, you know, how can we develop systematics models that are used more broadly and influence people. And I think the other thing is, you know, some of the ways that when you think about how systematics and the society overall feels and aspirationally has impact in the world, sometimes we would love to have you know, more limits to growth or kind of broad dissemination and impact around the world. And I think that you know, we've shown that there's at least one other strategy besides writing a book that seems successful. So I just name that as some other people to kind of keep in mind. So I think what I'll do is to turn off my video just for the moment, and that way I just make sure I know we have people around the world, but I'll make sure that my screen sharing will work well, and we'll get right to it. So Hector, let's see, I've got the tiny little views of people to the right, so I can't see, but if Hector, if you could give either a verbal or a thumbs up, that'd be great.
Yes, we can see the En-ROADS simulation app.
Okay, and I made it go full screen. Is it still visible fine?
Working good, yep.
Okay, great. So that's what we want to hear. We don't want technical difficulties. Okay, so what I really love to do is, this is the En-ROADS Climate Simulator. It is available online. enroads.org is one way to get there. The app, that'll take you. But what I really want to focus on is to envision what we're trying to do here. We've got 2 main graphs, and in fact, I might even, 2 main graphs here where we have energy supply on the left graph. And that's, you know, what is providing all the energy in the world. And this is a global model, but it's providing all the energy around the world. It's coal, oil in red, gas, natural gas, renewables, which includes hydro and wind and solar. Bioenergy is pink, nuclear is the blue, new tech is a placeholder technology for something like cold fusion or you know, some future technology that's still in the lab. And if you burn all of those fuels and provide energy in this means from 2000 to 2100, you produce temperature, you produce greenhouse gas emissions, and you produce radiative forcing, and we have all of this simulated in the model. And then you produce temperature change. And the result here, as you can see, is that we have 4.1 degrees of temperature change in the year 2100. So that's what it is. So the question here is like, how can we help people get to the transition? What are some of the ways that you'd like to have people bend this curve, reduce temperature change, the right-hand graph here, and bring it down into the targets that have been agreed upon by almost all the countries of the world. So, 2 degrees, below 2 degrees, well below 2 degrees, and aiming towards 1.5 degrees Celsius in the year 2100. So that's the goal. We've set it up a little bit of a game in which you can design policies. So I will actually open this up to a little bit of the back and forth and raise your hands. Is what's the first policy that we should try? Anyone want to unmute or raise your hand? And Hector, I'm going to ask for a little help here, just because, again, it's a little hard sometimes to see everyone when you're in the middle of presenting. When you think of climate change solutions, what's something that pops to your mind? And it doesn't even have to be on the screen right now. You can just go ahead and name something that you'd love to have happen.
One thing that I would love to see happen, which I think is kind of put into the model, I'd be curious to get your perspective on, but I would love to see agricultural systems that are perennial and not annual.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to save that for just a little bit later. And of course, it makes sense that the first thing out of this group is, hey, let's look at the natural-based solutions and that kind of angle. So maybe then what I'll do, though, is I'll comment on a few things around actually, I'll make a couple points here, and then we'll keep moving. So sometimes someone will say renewables, or sometimes some people say drive electric vehicles. And so let's take a look at, or maybe let's say, insulating homes better. So let's say what happens on insulating homes. So insulating homes is we go to the building and we improve their energy efficiency, which would be insulating homes. That's the slider here in the kind of the middle of the page. And what you can look at is, well, let's change this. We can just slide it and you'll see all of the lines move in real time. That's the point, is that we want this to be interactive. We want it to be live. So if we improve it a little bit, do we think that building energy efficiency is going to matter a lot, a little? Like the question then at some point is, the 4.1 degrees temperature change, is that going to go down to 3.5, or is that going to go to, up? Is it going to go to 4.3? Where is it going to be? And so let's do that right now. We can increase it a moderate amount, and we'll see that maybe it has, in this scenario, by this policy, that it has, 0.3 of a degree Celsius warming. And we've tried to build this in, and now the zoom bar is floating over my screen, so let's make sure I can get that out of the way. And we can replay the last change. So you can see the sliders moving, and you can see all the lines moving. So another interactive part that we like to have do is, what is changing on the fuel side? Would anyone like to comment on what they see changing? Ben, since you were unmuted first.
Yeah, it's clearly observable that with the increased energy efficiency there, that the slopes of all the energy uses have flattened slightly.
Exactly. And you're seeing changes in coal, you're seeing changes in gas, and even renewables are going down. Oil, though, the red line here, it's kind of at the top, is not changing much. Why would that be?
For transport?
Exactly. So I think it was Elena. That's exactly right. So what we have here is oil is used, of course, in different sectors. It's used in the transport sector above here. So we try to have, of course, all the fuels being used by the infrastructure, whether that's buildings or capital, other forms of capital, I guess, like cars themselves or trucks and planes. And that's used predominantly in the transport sector, and by that, those investments in that sector. And so therefore, it is something where it doesn't change very much. And these are the kinds of insights that people have. They think, oh, we're going to do something and everything's going to go down. And then we have other reactions, which is why did renewables go down? Well, we can switch into a different view in which we see a lot of different graphs. And by the way, we can play them all kind of live, where we see all the different things happening. And what's one of the reasons that renewables might be going down? It's kind of hard to see. Well, one reason renewables is going down is this left-hand graph over here, which if we click on it, we can get a bigger view, where energy consumption is going down. Total energy consumption is going down. And we know that because when we looked at the primary energy demand, all of those lines were going down. So the scale is staying the same, all those lines are going down, total energy demand is going down. And we have in the model feedbacks between costs and infrastructure investment. So when energy demand goes down, less capital is being, energy infrastructure is being built. We're making fewer capital investments into the energy sector, and that's great. We don't want to build as many coal plants, but we also aren't building as many solar plants, et cetera, which has cost implications, et cetera. And we can then see overall what's happening. And that's one reason that renewables goes down, is because energy demand goes down, and we just don't need to build as much of everything, coal, natural gas plants, and renewables for that matter. So those are the kind of feedbacks that you can build into a rich model like this. So one of the things I also want to bring out is also, actually, I'm switching graphs and I'm going to kind of reset things. So we're now back to the, excuse me, I wanted to do that button. We're now back to the default scenario. We're not doing energy efficiency in buildings. The slider down here, we're at 4.1 degrees Celsius. So we're at the original scenario. Let's do something else. Let's focus on cleaning up the energy supply. So there's a lot of different things we can do. For instance, we can look at the Kaya graph, which is a different way to show some of the graphs, which is we've got population growth, we have GDP per capita, so we've got economic growth. We have energy intensity. How much energy does it take to produce a unit of GDP? We have capital intensity, carbon intensity of the energy. How much carbon is emitted every time I produce a unit of energy. And then if you multiply this 4 things, you get CO2 emissions from energy. So this is more of an identity. That's why it's a Kaya identity. And so you take population times GDP per capita times energy per GDP times carbon per energy, you get carbon per year. And that is the emissions. So when we think about focusing on renewables, what section of this kind of equation are we focusing on? Anyone? Go ahead.
The 4th and the 5th graph?
The 4th and the 5th. These two? No, these two?
Yeah, so if
Yep.
I increase renewables, I should decrease the carbon intensity and the CO2 emissions for energy.
Exactly. Yep. So the 5th graph is always going to be a product of the other 4. So, but yes, you're right. So if you're going to change this 4th graph, the emissions are going to be changed. And just to show you, the building efficiency worked on a different graph. The building efficiency worked on the energy intensity. So when I changed that one, kind of going back to the policy we did, you can see the carbon intensity of energy isn't changing significantly, but the energy intensity is going down. We're just more efficient with our buildings. So we can produce the same amount of GDP just using less energy. We saw that by the total energy going down. But when we reset that, and I'll use this button here to reset things, and we focus on renewables, we're going to see the carbon intensity going down. So this is one view of how you're affecting different parts of the economy. So let's go back to the one view I want to kind of focus on. And as we produce renewables, we're now going to increase the green line. That's the left side. And we're decreasing the black area predominantly. This is the black area is energy carbon emissions. So this is basically the burning of fossil fuels. Carbon coming from fossil fuels is largely this black area on the right-hand graph. So those are the types of things we can do. Let's focus on one other one, which is, we did mention oil. And so what can we do to decrease oils? Well, we can focus on this energy transport. So a very popular thing that I'm hearing, in some circles is electric vehicles. You know, if you haven't driven an electric vehicle, by the way, you really ought to. They're a lot of fun. But what if we electrify? So this is where I'd like you to stop for a minute and think to yourself, what if we drag this electrification slider and we start electrifying at a pretty significant rate? What if we drag it to the maximum that we allow? How much temperature change? What do you think is going to happen? And how much temperature change are we going to prevent? I could cold call people if that's a better way to do it. That's what we do at MIT Sloan, is we get people to like speak up. But I know a lot of people maybe aren't in audiences.
I'll jump in here. So I guess if we're not increasing the proportion of renewable energy that is contributing to that electricity generation, then perhaps it wouldn't have a very large impact, maybe a couple of tenths of a degree.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. So you're saying, okay, well, if we don't have a change in the sort of the energy supply, maybe it's not going to have a huge impact. But I think if I heard you right, you said a few tenths of a degree, if that of impact. So let's take a look.
That would be my guess.
Yeah. Okay. So let's take a look. And so we're going to drag it up. I mean, we're seeing, focus for a minute on the left graph, the lines graph. You're seeing the red go down, right? That's what I think everyone expects. Oil use is going down. So let's just be extreme and let's just drag it all the way up. Oil use is going down. It's taking a while, by the way, before we start bending the curve, because we have capital stock turnover. The existing vehicles fleet isn't immediately retired. We have a separate policy where you can start thinking about doing some early retirements. All of these dots in the interface, by the way, bring up advanced views. So we can, we can change when things happen. We can change the timing of policies. You'll see the red line kind of shifting out because we're now starting this policy much, much later. For that matter, by the way, a lot of these sliders have descriptions as I show you what's happening. And we also have help, by the way, built in, so you can actually kind of see all the help that's on various topics. So you're seeing the red change in the right-hand graph, but you're seeing temperature change, even with that huge reduction in oil use, temperature change going down only a tenth of a degree. And what else are you seeing? And Kristen, I'll pick on you one more time. What else? What are you seeing that's of note?
The coal use went up.
Exactly. Coal, and for that matter, renewables is also going up. But that's because energy demand is going up. Excuse me, energy demand is falling. But what we're trying to do here is oil's going down. But oil's going down. We have to get our electricity to now power the transport sector, or at least a much higher fraction of the transport sector from somewhere. So we're now burning a mix of fuels more, renewables included, but we're now switching effectively some portion of oil for coal, a dirtier fuel. And so why is coal going up? Aren't we supposed to be in a world, and haven't you heard all the headlines that coal is on its way out and being phased out? Well, those are great headlines, particularly in the United States and in the United States and the European Union. But if you picked up the newspaper a week or two ago, you'll see that Australia is now thinking of opening an entirely new multi-billion-dollar coal exporting facility and mine, with the idea that they're going to be shipping coal for the next 40 years to Asian markets. This is actually expanding their coal production by a significant chunk, like just absolute terms, a significant chunk. And that's the kind of thing where there are still very large markets globally that would use coal because it's still cheap. So we need to do something to disincentivize the investment in coal. And that can be by incentivizing something else, renewables. That can be by removing, currently the status quo includes sort of fossil subsidies. So maybe we just remove some of the subsidies, the public subsidies, or we could tax coal specifically, which is some way of another kind of flip side of removing the subsidies. Or we could do something which I'm sure you've heard, which is add some sort of carbon price. And that might be an effective way to kind of put downward pressure on the dirtier fuels. But it's that combination that's needed. We can't just focus on electrification of electrification of transport, what we need to do is we need to focus on cleaning the energy supply that would then power all of that additional wheels on the road that are using electricity. So that's one of those examples of, it's important to have a simulator to help people see all of the interconnectedness that happens. And this is something we know as system dynamicists. We know why we do system dynamics. We know that often there are non-intuitive insights and interactions and the delays in the system, having the capital stock turnover, just resetting things, having like a delay to something of oil only going down in 2050, 2040, to start to really bend the curve. And that's because of capital stock turnover delays and all of the other things that make system dynamics and a methodology that's really useful to apply to so many different disciplines, including, of course, agricultural and food, that we're using those types of approaches to approach and building decision support tool around energy system more broadly, but energy system and actually, climate solutions more broadly. So that's how we think of En-ROADS as a climate solution simulator.
Travis, I think that Dina has a question, and Dina, if you want to go for it.
Okay, Hector, thank you. Travis, your work's very interesting. I'm from Indonesia. Probably in Indonesia, renewable energy should be more intensified for the fossil fuels, such as like batteries consumption. Is it truly needed for the fossil also? So regarding your model, so what is the energy supply affected by your renewable energy simulation? Is it only for coal itself or another sources like maybe wind or solar panel or something like that?
Well, it's great. So thank you for the question, and I really appreciate the aspect and when we think about how it's being used and I see a question from Andreas also in the chat about kind of local. I'll kind of answer maybe Andreas your questions right now also. So
sure. You
mentioned the differences in Indonesia policy and how things are applied, and one of the things is this is a global model, and so it might not reflect, say, Indonesia's particular energy mix and how what the current supply is with the mix of these lines over on the left, because it is trying to look at global things. We've calibrated and we can bring all those things up so we can look at the graphs menu and look at the model comparisons.
I see.
And we have a variety of different ways where we also are including things like the energy mix. We don't have those in the models, but this is showing how we compare on the climate side. We're actually working on bringing in projections of various other things into our models. So, this is a global model. And but to answer your question around when we do a policy like the renewable policy, what is it affecting? How is it affecting things? Well, this is where I get to say something I don't normally get to say in various other fora. But hey, we're using a logit model, and so and we're using a logit model based on costs. So when you look at another graph that I did kind of bring up, when we look at the cost of electricity, the new investment on any given year is essentially a logit function of the relative costs. So as long as coal stays super cheap, it's going to get some slice of investment, just because that's how the logit models work. And we believe that that is an appropriate representation of the heterogeneity in the world, such that some Asian countries are still investing in coal, even though it might be phased out in other parts of the world. So that's the kind of application there.
Excellent. Okay.
And Andreas, it is a global model. It is not a model that can be easily applied to local and sort of subnational scales. And we are always interested in trying to figure out how to work with someone to maybe make a national model, or et cetera. But I think the key thing here is the niche that we feel that our model fills at the moment is really helping conversations at any scale in the system. It's not just UN officials, but it's even national officials or city officials and town officials, and for that matter, church groups and scout groups and lobby groups and citizen organizations. We worked with students around the world and universities, everything. We feel that it's a great way to bring everyone onto the same page about what it takes and the types of policies that we have to be, all of us, pushing for in order to have the climate solution that we need as a world. So you can use this model to say, well, you know, we might not have control over our energy supply, but we should make sure that whenever we have a chance to influence maybe a state, I apologize for using the United States as a lot of references to United States policies, but I'm sure hopefully you can find, but we have a lot of states that might be leading on their own with climate policy as opposed to a federal policy. And so, you know, a city might not have the ability to control their energy supply, but maybe they need to make sure that whenever they can, that they still support a state policy that promotes renewables, or a state policy that also promotes different transportation changes. But maybe a city can say, well, we can't control these things directly. You know, when given the opportunity, we'll make sure that we know how to provide our input and what we'd like to say. But maybe we can do things to improve the energy efficiency of buildings and affect walkable cities and various other things that would really change the local dynamics, often for the better. Often, of course, like if you build a more walkable city, you're going to decrease transport emissions, but you're also going to have a healthier population and often happier people. So there's lots of things. But Andreas, if I didn't fully answer your question, feel free to restate it or unmute. Maybe I'll give a quick pause there. Is that good, Andreas?
Oh yeah, thank you, Travis. Really good. And I think actually the reason I'm asking is that I'm working with some cities and municipalities in Sweden, and they have at least a certain degree of control of their energy supply. So yeah, thank you.
Great. And I know that the society, by the way, is having a hackathon, which I don't know too much about. In fact, I think it starts shortly, but they're working with the city of Bergen to come up with you know, a low carbon strategy, which I think for the next 48 hours. So if you didn't get that email from the society, I think there's probably still maybe a chance to join the hackathon. So that should be another way. But sorry, that's Norway, not Sweden, but yes. So Natalia, excuse me, please.
Hi, thanks. I understand that the questions and ideas will come later, right? About the use of the model and so on. But now I was wondering, we've been focusing a lot on the emissions, and I was wondering if we could work a little bit on the other side, which is on the removal. Specifically, I have in mind the tryout of forest conservation and reforestation programs that have become somehow more popular recently. Should we play a little bit with that?
Thank you. Yeah. And this is, given the time, I'm also thinking it's a good time to segue over to our conversation a little more focused on the food and nature-based solutions, picking up Ben's question, et cetera. So, so thank you. So one of I brought back the right-hand graph now on emissions by gas. Normally I do some pedagogical tricks about like, oh, you know, what are the emissions coming from this, or what don't you see? But I think we kind of all know this, but so maybe I'll fast forward a little bit. But you know, let's say we're going to pass a policy where we say, you know what, we just got to focus on renewables, and we got to focus on buildings, and we got to do a lot of things where we electrify, and we do some words that one phrase is strategic electrification, where we got a carbon price to kind of disincentivize, and we're doing maybe even additional renewables and energy efficiency in the transport. So we see a lot of change. And this is a huge policy, but it's not focusing on what Natalia mentioned is sort of the removals, or another way that we often phrase it, and I'll just use the analogy that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, sort of the bathtub model, where emissions are the faucet coming into the bathtub, the amount of gases in the atmosphere is the level of the bathtub, and then removals is the drain of the bathtub. That's taking emissions out of the atmosphere and hopefully putting them away for as long as possible. Sorry, carbon out of the atmosphere, not emissions, out of the atmosphere and putting away as long as possible. And so we can do that through natural systems. We can also do that through other types of methodologies, such as technological removal, and that's represented here in this right-hand graph. And one interesting thing and a punchline is of the model often is it takes a lot of everything. You know, we have to have a multifaceted approach. One phrasing of that, of course, is there's no silver bullet. There's no single solution, single policy solution that will really solve it all. We can't just electrify transport. We can't just focus on renewables. We have to do a lot if we're trying to have that goal of getting below, well below 2 degrees and as close to 1.5 as we can. So let's look at that. So we got land emissions. And Natalia, I think you mentioned deforestation in particular at first, so maybe I'll just focus on that. And this is a little bit on the emissions side. So it's still on the faucet of the bathtub because these are now emissions. So what if we decrease those to be as small as possible? And what you're seeing in the right graph is the green area, which I can even make bigger. You're seeing the 0 here is below the green predominantly. So you're seeing right now we have positive emissions coming from land, from deforestation in the forests. And so what if we start to shrink that? And you'll see the green area falling, and it's actually going to even go a little bit below the line because we're now decreasing deforestation such that the natural systems net are going to start becoming a sink, at least some portion of them. And we can increase that even more by planting more trees. So we're now seeing that there's now the green line is shifting and coming down. But even all of this, I bet there's something that might catch your eye in this right-hand graph. And does anyone want to comment on something?
I mean, it's still surprising that it's not going down that fast. Hmm?
And what, because of what? Can you just say a little more, please? What's not going down, and what did you think would be more significant?
Yeah, the maximum temperature, right? The temperature at 2100. It's not really that big of a change by just stopping the forest cutting, the deforestation.
Yeah.
Well, I would probably, my guess would be that it's because if we take the year 2000 as a baseline, then most likely at that time, the forest, the amount of forest that was there, it was already not sufficient to neutralize the emissions.
Well,
yeah.
So I think there's a couple things going on there. So I agree, and that you know, we've gone through periodically, I think, over the history of the world, but it's sort of cutting down all of our trees and then letting some regrow, and are they a net source or a net sink? And there's a balance there that has actually changed kind of over time, but predominantly we've, you know, cut down a lot, and the rate of deforestation is higher. So it's a source, but most of the time there's a buildup of carbon in the forests, and they are an important sink. And I, by the way, say it's a really important sink that we just keep as a sink, as opposed to, that's one way I think we shouldn't cut down any more trees. We need to stop deforestation. It'd be great to plant more trees or switch to other technologies that I know, other farming practices in particular, such as silvopasture, where we actually can increase the amount of trees we have. But you're right, you know, there's a lot of carbon flux in and out, but the net might be smaller than you imagine. You know, I guess I'll just say that that's the way I'd phrase it is, you know, the net, what's actually being stored still is, the fluxes might be bigger than all of the fossil emissions fluxes, and yet the net, you know, because of respiration, in and out, seasonal variations, the net might be lower than some of the huge anthropogenic emissions coming from the fossils. And you can kind of see that just by, if we reset everything, potentially you remember how big the black area is. So the amount that preventing deforestation can do, has to be small, just because it's the green wedge. Another way to phrase that is deforestation can't have a huge impact to some degree because it's just smaller than all of the other sources of emissions, or at least many of the other sources of emissions, excuse me. And so one of the things that is important, another thing I'll just say, and this is a little prelude to where we'll be in a few minutes, is we are revising some of this forest, how the forestry works. So that's something we're looking at actively, and it may have a slightly bigger impact than it currently does in the model, but we're still evaluating and making sure we're using the best available science. Another, yep, sorry.
Just a quick question about the deforestation, afforestation. Does it also take into account the impact of ocean or marine algae?
So we don't include blue carbon as another raise for algae growth. So that's not part of our forests.
Okay.
But we in the model we do have things like, we have ocean acidification. So which is just a way, we can look at that. This is what's happening to the oceans and their acidification. And that is because we have things, and I'm showing you this mainly because you can see other parts of the model where we state all of our assumptions up front. And you can now go through and look at various parts of things like climate sensitivities, these are the physics of the system, and things about construction time and delays. You can change those on the fly, and just say like, oh, how long does it take to renewables to deploy or something like that, and you can just change that on the fly. But one of the reasons I bring that up is we have something ocean mixing, so we have carbon flowing in, and you can change the rate in which that's going into the ocean. So but that is purely carbon going into the water and not algae. So yeah, so one of the things that's important to look at though, when even in this policy, is that we still have very large methane and N2O. So that's one of the important things that we've now focused on energy supply and transport and buildings, and maybe we could focus on population or economic growth activities, kind of a consumption story. But we still haven't really addressed some of these other things. And we can start looking at that by focusing on some of the other gases. But I pause here because we're at 2.6 with a lot of these other policies, and that means without focusing on agriculture and making changes, some of the natural systems, there's no way to get to 2 or below 2. And I think that that's something that sometimes the energy people don't hear and understand, is they think that all we need to do is decarbonize the energy supply and then move everything to electricity, like all the cars to electricity. But there are still enough other things that if we want to reach that goal, and because we've delayed so long, and there's lots of reasons why we need to have an all hands on deck, every approach possible system, things would be different if this were 1990. But it's 2020, and we need to take a variety of approaches, and quickly, and we can look at methane. So if I bring up the advanced views, we can turn on detailed settings and look at things like agricultural waste specifically, or we can look at industrial uses of methane and N2O and the F gases. So refrigerants is largely F gases. And we can also change the year that these are happening. So we can look at this. And this is getting to where I want to kind of end up some of the conversation, which is we've been pushed through a lot of this and pushed by others to really build out effectively this methane and other slider, to really speak more towards a lot of the nature-based solutions in papers like Griscom et al. And a variety of things, whether it's project drawdown solutions, et cetera. And we are actively doing that. We are redoing our land use and carbon cycle model. And I was hoping to show you a demonstration of that originally when Hector and I started talking a few months back about me presenting. But what I wanted to do is just say, you can use this right now to talk about land and food system stuff. In fact, we actually have a blog post, which if I hopefully find it quickly, how to talk about food and En-ROADS. So we have that on our website here at climateinteractive.org. But we are also actively changing it so that we can now, this methane and other might get retitled. And when you drag into this advanced view, instead of having a few things like agricultural and waste and energy and industry emissions, those other gases, we might actually have practices such as silver pasture, such as improving soil carbon and soil health, such as Ben, I'm blanking on what you recommended. Apologies. But where we are, conservation tillage or something like that, where we're building up sort of that approach. I think that's more what you were saying, Ben. But where there's more perennials. I don't know if we're all perennials, to be honest, but where we have, but if you have more land cover, ground cover, year round, then that might be a good proxy where we have sort of the tillage or the no-till policy there. So it's that kind of thing where we're hoping to add a lot more detail to expand things out in the food system. And to be frank, we're actually looking, we'd love to have people react and provide input, because we really prefer not to do our modeling as an insular body among the modelers here at Climate Interactive, but we really do read a lot of papers, bring in the best available science, and then try to have other people react to what we've done and make sure that it's sufficient to have an external review. So I'm looking at the time, and I'd love to switch it over to questions, but I could also talk about the technology also if people would love to do. Maybe I'll spend 1 minute more on the technology, if that's okay, and then we could go to just open it up, Hector.
Sounds good.
Okay, so I am trying to bring up a new tab in my browser, but maybe, oh, I'm not in the right focus. Here we go. There we go. So how have we done this? We model in Vensim, and we also spent at Climate Interactive time developing our own translator called SD Everywhere. It's at sdeverywhere.org. That is freely available, that we've published to the systematics community to translate from Vensim to C, the computer language of C, but also into JavaScript to make and it even can make basic web pages if you're a little bit, without much, I'll say no programming, but maybe a little bit of text editing if you're familiar with just sort of editing text files. And so I wanted to name that this is the technology we're using. If you're not someone who's super technical, SD Cloud, which is another service run by a gentleman, Ivan, who's come to the Systematics Societies also. You can actually upload an MDL file and download the output of SD Everywhere. They have a cloud-hosted converter. But this is something that's there. It is open source, so you can go to GitHub if you want and view the instructions and download the code. But the number one thing is we built in the idea of some basic web interfaces. So you can make a basic web interface by editing some text files and to define your graphs and such. But the other functionality is it allows for validating models, running your model if you need to on a cluster, if you want to do a Monte Carlo analysis or sensitivity analysis. We're using the tool in a variety of ways and expect to use it in even more ways down the road. But we use SD Everywhere to convert our entire model into JavaScript. This is a pretty big model. I think it's like 15,000 simultaneous equations. It runs fast in JavaScript, hosted here on my laptop. So when you go to En-ROADS and load the simulator, the entire model gets loaded into your browser on JavaScript and run locally. It's not hosted in the cloud. And it's not like Forio or a different system. So that's why it gets to be very fast and interactive. And so that's one of the ways, that's the technology we're using. We had to do this custom interface on top of the output from SD Everywhere. So we're using more than what SD Everywhere provides, but that's something also, depending on people's skills or whether they're on a team, it's one way to take your systemics models out of Vensim, if that's what you're using, and bring them into a world, into a much richer environment. And it's this interface that really has opened a lot of doors to us. We feel that if we have walked around in the past bringing Vensim into people's offices or like sitting down with our laptop, but now people can explore it on their own, hosted on a web server. And it's really powerful, and people have really reacted positively to it. And that's at all levels. If you remember the decision makers, the media, and the climate leaders in society, all three of those levels react nicely to this user interface, and that's, we feel, a big win. So I can talk more about the technology if that's where people want to go, but at this point, I would love to have more questions.